In America, there have been many sporting events that have taken on a life of their own, becoming annual traditions that make the whole country stand still and watch. And the oldest of these time-honored sporting events is the Kentucky Derby. Started in 1875, only a decade and 1 month after the conclusion of the Civil War, by Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., the grandson of William Clark from the Lewis and Clark expedition. It has never missed a year, persisting through stock market crashes, 2 world wars, and pandemics. No matter what was going on in the world, the best 3-year-old thoroughbreds in America would run further than they've ever gone before, 1.25 miles under the Twin Spires, whether it was in front of 0 people or 170,000. It's not just a horse race, it's a part of history, becoming the first jewel of America's Triple Crown, the greatest prize any racehorse could ever earn. Following the 1.25 mile Kentucky Derby, you have the 1 3/16 Preakness in Maryland, and lastly, the Test of Champions, the 1.5 mile Belmont Stakes in New York. And every racehorse has only one chance to do this at the young age of 3. So to celebrate the 150th running of the Kentucky Derby, we're going to go back in time and reflect on every horse who has ever won the greatest 2 minutes in sports, starting with the most famous that have won the first Saturday in May, along with potentially the Triple Crown at the tip of the iceberg. And then we go below the surface, towards the midnight zone, to its first winners, who have been nearly lost to time. Here is the Kentucky Derby winner's Iceberg.
And they're off in the Kentucky Derby!
Secretariat. How else would I begin diving into the Kentucky Derby winner's Iceberg than with the greatest horse to ever win the Run for the Roses? Secretariat, or Big Red, became the first racehorse to win the greatest 2 minutes in sports in under 2 minutes, winning in 1:59.4 seconds, a record that has yet to be broken. But what came afterward was even greater. He won the Preakness, and then the Belmont Stakes, where he ran the fastest 1.5 miles ever on the dirt surface, and won by 31 lengths, becoming the first horse in a quarter of a century to win the Triple Crown. The Belmont Stakes specifically was considered the 13th greatest sporting moment of all time by Sports Illustrated. After the Triple Crown, he would race 6 more times, further adding to his legacy, as he beat older horses and also suffered 2 monumental upsets by the same horse trainer, Alan Jerkins. But between every loss, a new record was set, whether on dirt or on the grass. He is dubbed by many to be the greatest racehorse to ever live. And when he passed away at age 19, his autopsy revealed that he had a 22-pound heart, twice the weight of the average horse. Seattle Slew. The ultimate rags to riches horse racing story, he was purchased as a yearling for only $17,500 by Karen and Mickey Taylor, a flight attendant and a logger. The horse they'd buy would remain undefeated for 9 races, the highlights being the 1977 Kentucky Derby, Preakness, and Belmont, becoming the first to complete the Triple Crown unbeaten. But only 3 weeks later, he was shipped to California in a foolish decision that saw him lose for the first time. An illness that coincided kept him out of commission for 10 months, but when he returned, he had 2 races against the 1978 Triple Crown winner, Affirmed, the only time 2 American Triple Crown winners ever faced off in the same race. Ironically, in their second match, neither won, as they got into a speed duel in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. Big mistake considering it was the same grueling distance as the Belmont Stakes. Affirmed gave way first, but despite running the first half faster than Secretariat, Seattle Slew only lost by a nose, fighting against the better rested Exceller the whole way. Ironically, the undefeated Triple Crown winner's best performance was one that he lost. A great racing career to be sure, but it's nothing compared to his career as a stallion. At his peak, he was valued at $120 million, producing 111 stakes winners, and many great horses afterward descend back to him. A far cry from a $17,500 yearling. Affirmed. Only a year after Seattle Slew won the Triple Crown, horse racing was rocked once again by not just Affirmed, but his rival Alydar. They would face against each other 10 times during their careers. After 6 duels as 2-year-olds, they would compete on separate coasts leading up to the Derby, both being perfect. But when they returned, Affirmed remained top dog, just like the previous year, holding off Alydar in the Derby and Preakness, guided to victory by his 18-year-old jockey Steve Cauthen, a sensation just as famous as Affirmed himself. But in the Belmont, Alydar attacked immediately, and the two fought the entire 1.5 miles, inseparable, providing one of the greatest stretch duels in horse racing, but Affirmed did it again to win the Triple Crown. But after his greatest moment of triumph only 2 starts later, Affirmed hit a slump, losing 5 straight, starting with a defeat to Alidar by disqualification, and then being beaten twice by Seattle Slew. But after a jockey change to Lafitte Pincay Jr., he won his final 7 races in a row and became the richest horse in the world, and the first to break $2 million, dethroning the original holder Kelso. A great racehorse only made better by the high caliber of opponents he faced, with his greatest being Alidar. Spectacular Bid. To end the 1970s, after 2 straight years of Triple Crown winners, we were followed by the greatest horse to lose the Triple Crown. Spectacular Bid also stands on his own for his unique color, being one of the greatest gray horses along with Native Dancer, and for his love of donuts. He liked glaze the best, but after big races he got chocolate donuts, despite chocolate being poisonous to horses. Spectacular Bid certainly didn't care. He was a champion, impervious to poison. He went into the Kentucky Derby winning 11 in a row. The only thing people were worried about was a horse named Great Redeemer, a horse considered one of the worst Derby starters ever, losing 5 races by a combined 86 lengths. The worry was that an undisciplined horse would cause trouble. Turns out the horse was not a problem at all, and was soundly beaten. And after a long career, he was retrained into a show horse, and was successful, thus being redeemed. But back to the bid. Spectacular Bid would do just as expected, winning the Derby and the Preakness, with many thinking the Belmont was open and shut, but he stepped on a safety pin the day of and was rushed to the lead, exhausting himself and finishing 3rd. After that, the only horse who would ever beat him was Affirmed, who took on the role of older horse, defeating the youngster in that year's Jockey Club Gold Cup, a reverse of Affirmed's feud with Seattle Slew the previous year. After this, the Bid would win 10 in a row, including running the fastest mile and a quarter on dirt in history, 157.8, and in his final race, he scared away all challengers and raced against himself. But his loss in the Belmont started the 37-year Triple Crown drought, the longest in America's history. But in 2015, a horse would finally be the one. American Pharoah. Trainer Bob Baffert was no stranger to losing the Triple Crown, having 4 horses win 2 jewels but never 3. But in 2015, he was given a horse with a spelling error, with the O and A at the end of Pharoah's name being in the wrong order. After losing his first race, he won 4 straight going into the Derby and became the favorite. Baffert also saddled the second choice, the undefeated Dortmund. And there were still many other touted runners, making it a Derby with more star power than usual, drawing the greatest Derby crowd ever seen. 170,513 people all watched as American Pharoah did what everyone expected him to do, win the Kentucky Derby, and then 2 weeks later he would cruise through a swamp in the Preakness. And then came the Belmont. With 90,000 in attendance and all of America watching, American Pharoah ended the drought and stepped into immortality, winning the Triple Crown. He'd have 3 more starts afterward, even a surprise upset at Saratoga, also known as the Graveyard of Champions, but he finished on top, defeating older horses in the Breeders' Cup Classic, giving himself a unique Grand Slam. War Admiral. While he's most famous for being the rival of Seabiscuit in real life and in an Oscar-nominated motion picture, he is a lot more than that. While in the movie he was falsely depicted as an 18-hand Goliath, the real Admiral was barely over 15 two-hands, or 5'2" at the withers. He was the same height as Seabiscuit. He was the best son of the original Big Red, Man o' War, a horse who never ran in the Kentucky Derby. But when War Admiral turned 3 in 1937, Sam Riddle, who had owned both horses, decided to give it a go, and came out with a Triple Crown winner. He did it pretty easily as well, except for a small hiccup in the Belmont Stakes when he cracked his hoof at the start and bled the entire mile and a half, but he still won the race with relative ease and set a track record, even with his leg and stomach covered in blood. At one point, he won 18 of 20 races, and overall won 21 of 26, but easily his most famous was one he lost, a match race to Seabiscuit. It had been prepared for months, with many failed attempts, but finally in November of 1938, they met, and War Admiral was beaten at his own game, with Seabiscuit taking the lead and running him around the entire field to win by 4 lengths. Despite this infamous defeat, the only reason why it was so infamous was because War Admiral had such an aura of invincibility. Northern Dancer. Continuing our talk of little horses, Northern Dancer was certainly paltry in size, 940 pounds and barely 15 hands in height before the Kentucky Derby. He was so small no one bought him as a yearling. He then became a champion in both his home country of Canada and America. He won the Derby in record time and then the Preakness. And in Canada, he won the Queen's Plate, the Canadian version of the Kentucky Derby that has been run continuously for even longer, being run since 1860. It was a race career so good, he got included into the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame only a year after he retired, standing alongside human athletes. But none of that really compares to the fact that he is one of the most important sires in horse racing, producing 147 stakes winners, including an English Triple Crown winner in Nijinsky II, and then also producing the first yearling to be sold for $10 million. I could go on forever, but the easiest way to summarize it is that it's harder to find a champion from the last 50 years that did not descend from Northern Dancer. Sunday Silence. Another brilliant example of a legend on and off the track, Sunday Silence is loved the world over, starting out as a hard-headed, crooked youngster who nearly died in a car crash when his driver had a heart attack on the road. But by the Derby, he was a distant second choice to the nearly unbeatable East Coast champion Easy Goer. The two became bitter rivals, with it still being a hot debate on who was better. Sunday Silence won on paper, winning the Derby, Preakness, and Breeders' Cup Classic, but Easy Goer destroyed Sunday Silence in the Belmont by double digits. Many Easy Goer fans will tell you that it was bad riding and luck that got Easy Goer beat, but that's its own can of worms. After retiring and being deemed a failure in America, Sunday Silence was exported to Japan, where he became the most important sire in Japanese racing history. Before, Japan had little success overseas, but through Sunday Silence's sons and daughters, Japan started winning everywhere. And now Sunday Silence's descendants are some of the best horses in the world, all originating from Japan and through Sunday Silence, the godfather of Japanese horse racing. Silver Charm. In the final 3 years of the 20th century, 3 horses won the first 2 jewels of the Triple Crown, but lost the Belmont Stakes. First up, Silver Charm, Baffert's second Derby horse. Only 1 year earlier, Baffert had lost the Derby by a nose, and he was already back. In the Derby and then the Preakness, Silver Charm would be sandwiched between 2 horses, the East Coast favorite Captain Bodgett to his outside, and Silver's West Coast rival Freehouse to the rail. He won them both by slim margins, but was caught by Touch Gold in the Belmont. He had a long and productive career afterward, even winning the richest race in the world at the time, the Dubai World Cup. But for the last 10 years, Silver Charm has peacefully lived at Old Friends, an aftercare facility for fully retired racehorses, where he is fed by adoring fans, and as of this recording, is the oldest living Kentucky Derby winner at 30 years old. Ironically, also at Old Friends, is the horse that denied him the Triple Crown, Touch Gold. Real Quiet. Only 1 year later, and Baffert had a second try at the Triple Crown, but not from where they thought. He had the Derby favorite in the lightly raced but unbeaten Indian Charlie, and he had his hard-working understudy Real Quiet, known around the barn as the Fish, because he was undersized. He had only been bought for $17,000, $500 less than Seattle Slew, and had won only 2 of 12 races. But 2 starts later, Real Quiet had won the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, and was 1.5 miles away from $5 million and becoming the first Triple Crown winner in 20 years. He lost it all by a nose. After being moved too early, he tired in deep stretch, and even after his jockey slammed into the late-flying victory gallop, he couldn't stop it from happening. It is the smallest margin a horse has lost the Triple Crown by, ever. Charismatic. The final Kentucky Derby winner of the 20th century was up for sale twice for $62,500 in claiming races, but after a lucky break in the Lexington Stakes in record time, he was given a chance at the Derby, and won at 31-1. Only a start later, he won the Preakness, now becoming the favorite for the Triple Crown. But instead of winning the Triple Crown, what happened was a true display of heroism by his jockey in the face of defeat. Charismatic lost the Belmont Stakes and fractured 2 bones in his leg. As soon as jockey Chris Antley felt something was wrong, he dismounted and held the horse's leg, preventing further damage and saving the horse's life. Charismatic lived to be 21 years old, but sadly Chris Antley died of a drug overdose only 1 year later, an unfortunate end to a great jockey. He was a true hero to his horse, and that's how he should be remembered, as a great example of what should never be forgotten in any equestrian sport, that the horse's well-being must come first. Fusaichi Pegasus. A name as memorable as it is easy to mispronounce, the horse had the whole package. He was purchased by Japanese billionaire Fusao Sekiguchi, who bought him for $4 million as a yearling, the highest price for a Derby winner in history. He named the horse after himself, Ichi, which means one, and the winged horse from Greek mythology. Going into the Derby as the favorite, many weren't sure what would happen. Leading up to the race, a new show had been implemented called The Works, which showed Derby horses training up to the big day. During it, Fupeg would goof off to the maximum, showing multiple ridiculous antics. But on race day, he was perfect, kicking off the 21st century by being the first Derby favorite to win since Spectacular Bid in 1979. After the Derby, he was sold for $70 million as a stud, becoming the most expensive racehorse to ever live, although he never truly delivered on that promise, winning one more race and producing some decent horses, but never enough to recoup that price tag. Funny Cide. Horse racing really is the sport for underdogs. Funny Cide was trained by a horse trainer who had never had a Derby horse, and his owners were a group of 10 childhood friends who all lived in a small town in upstate New York. Funny Cide was also a long shot, being 6th choice in the betting and was historically unfavored. He was a New York bred, and no horse born in New York had won the Derby, and he was a gelding. It had been 74 years since a gelding had won the Kentucky Derby, but the gutsy New York gelding did both, beating favorite Empire Maker, who would sire American Pharoah, and a horse owned by director Steven Spielberg. He would then win the Preakness by nearly 10 lengths, but ironically, when he returned to New York for the Belmont Stakes and a chance at the Triple Crown, he was defeated by Empire Maker. With no stud value, Funny Cide raced until he was 7 years old, staying a winner until his final start, before becoming a stable pony for a few years, and living his final 9 years at the Kentucky Horse Park, surrounded by love and admiring fans, who visited with hopes of seeing the Kentucky Derby winner. Smarty Jones. A horse with a truly tumultuous beginning. Before he ever stepped foot on the racetrack, the man who was supposed to train him, Bobby Kamak, who brought Smarty into the world by arranging the breeding of his parents, was murdered by his stepson. And when it was time to train the horse, he reared up and fractured his skull on the starting gate. But miraculously, he lived, and made everyone who had believed in him since day one proud, becoming the first undefeated Kentucky Derby winner since Seattle Slew. In fact, they both went into the Kentucky Derby unbeaten in 6 starts. Smarty continued his similarities with a win in the Preakness, but in front of 120,000 people, he was defeated in one of the most painful stretch duels in horse racing, as he was defeated by Birdstone in the Belmont Stakes, and never raced again due to an injury. He stayed a modest stud, and eventually was given a happy retirement in his home state of Pennsylvania, where he still receives Christmas cards, visitors, and a name drop in a rap song.
Hardly known, now you catching a court case? I'm Smarty Jones at the horse race.
Giacomo. Everyone loves to bet on a long shot, for the small chance that they could win. Giacomo would win the Kentucky Derby at 50-1, the second greatest upset in the race's history at the time, and still tied for 4th today, and providing a lucky few who bet on him the greatest bragging rights. He had only won once in 7 starts, but that didn't stop him from qualifying. He would benefit greatly from one of the fastest early paces in the Derby's history, picking up the pieces to defeat the even crazier long shot Closing Argument, who was 72-1, and a Fleet Alex, who won the Preakness in Belmont later on. Ironically, Giacomo's father, Holy Bull, was a Derby favorite 11 years prior, but had lost miserably. They also were ridden by the same rider, Mike Smith. The team of jockey Mike Smith, trainer John Sheriffs, and owner Jerry and Ann Moss came together only a few years later with the nearly undefeated Zenyatta, who won 19 of 20 races and is one of the best mares to ever race and one of the most beloved horses of the 21st century. But the dream team all started with a 50-1 long shot named after Sting's son, Giacomo. Mind That Bird. Only 4 years after Giacomo won at 50-1, another upset at the exact same odds would occur. Mind That Bird was a 15-hand gelding who traveled around. He started his career in Canada, being regarded as their best 2-year-old. The money he earned from his Canadian exploits proved vital as it got him into the Kentucky Derby, despite struggling in California and New Mexico leading up to it. and so his trainer Chip Woolley drove the horse more than 1,000 miles on a broken foot to the Kentucky Derby, and despite starting in dead last, he snuck through the rail and won by 6 3/4 lengths, the largest win margin in the Derby in over 63 years. He would then run in the top 3 in the Preakness and Belmont, but he never reached those heights again. But that one unfathomable victory has made him immortal, even getting him his own motion picture, although Mind That Bird earned more money on the track than his own movie did at the box office. He has enjoyed a quiet life since his glory days as a ranch horse, but every once in a while, he returns to Churchill Downs. Wherever he is greeted by admiring fans who all want to see the pint-sized horse who did the impossible. Barbaro. One of the saddest stories to come from the Kentucky Derby, Barbaro was named after a foxhound his owner's family once owned many years ago. Only 2 years after Smarty Jones, Barbaro was another undefeated favorite for the Kentucky Derby, starting as a grass horse, but proving his dirt ability by winning the Florida Derby. He then won the Kentucky Derby by 6.5 lengths, many thinking he was about to become the next great horse. But after breaking through the starting gates in the Preakness and being reloaded, he fractured his right hind leg soon after the start, and would fight for his life for the next 7 months. The whole nation wanted to see him prevail, and he fought every adversity that comes with a leg injury to the best of his ability, even recovering from a bad case of laminitis in his left hind leg, a condition that can be caused by extra weight being put on a leg for prolonged periods of time. But sadly, laminitis spread to his front legs in January of 2007, and it was decided to put him to sleep. He was a brilliant athlete, but the greatest thing about him was his heart, ensuring that he will never be forgotten. California Chrome. In 2011, a horse was born. His mother was bought for $8,000 and deemed a failure, and his sire was unexceptional. But by Derby Day 2014, the horse they created was the heavy favorite, having won 4 straight by 5 lengths minimum in the state he bears his name. Through his humble beginnings and victories in the Derby and Preakness, he gained a rabid fan base of people who proclaimed themselves Chromies, making him the most popular racehorse since Zenyatta. Although he did lose the Belmont Stakes, and the response from his owner complaining the Triple Crown was unfair and impossible is laughable considering what happened a year later, California Chrome had a full career, winning on the grass, in Dubai for the richest prize in the world, and under 132 pounds, forced to give 15 pounds to all opponents. He was a type of brilliant in horse racing that no longer exists, as horses just don't get campaigned like he did anymore. Justify. Only 3 years after American Pharoah, Baffert gave us the most recent and most controversial Triple Crown winner, a horse who left as soon as he came. He did not race at age 2 and was unbeaten in 3 starts leading up to the Kentucky Derby. Not racing at age 2 was a Derby superstition called the Apollo Curse, named after the only horse to win the Derby under those circumstances in 1882. Justify would break the curse and then do an Apollo Triple Crown, ending with a victory over Gronkowski, a horse named after and eventually partially bought by football player Rob Gronkowski. An injury caused his early retirement, so he only raced 6 times in the span of 5 months, and has since become a decent sire. But over a year after the fact, he was found to have failed a drug test in the Santa Anita Derby, the race that he won that got him qualified into the Kentucky Derby. The drug was scopolamine, an anti-nausea medication, and fast forward 6 years after his win in the Santa Anita Derby, he was officially disqualified, putting a cloud over his brief racing career. Rich Strike. In 2016, a horse trainer named Eric Reed had his darkest hour when 23 horses under his care all perished in a barn fire. Along with horses, tons of equipment and memorabilia from his career also were destroyed. 5 years later, he would claim a horse for $30,000, who won the race by 17 1/4 lengths. The horse named Rich Strike would make a full Derby campaign, but never finished better than 3rd, acquiring 21 points, the 21st highest amount. With the Derby only open to the top 20 horses, he was put in as an also eligible, an understudy, needing one more horse to drop out. Only minutes before the cutoff time, a horse would scratch, getting him into the Derby at the last minute. He was put at odds of 80 to 1, and no one thought he'd affect the race. Dropping dead last early, the opening half mile was one of the fastest in Derby history, helping set up the perfect storm for him to come from 17 1/4 lengths back, and expertly navigate past 19 horses to pull off the greatest upset the Derby had seen in 109 years. just like Giacomo, a fast pace had given him the chance to make history. Although like Giacomo and Mind That Bird, he never reached those heights again, and his racing career is in limbo, being retired and then pulled out of a sale to be put back into training, unretiring him, although it's unlikely he'll race again. Regardless, he'll be known as a scrappy, mean chestnut horse that was in the right place at the right time to make history, which is the beauty of horse racing. And that will conclude the first layer of the Kentucky Derby iceberg. We've now gotten our feet wet, but now, in layer 2, we will begin our descent, talking about still relatively well-known racehorses, but not at the same level as a Secretariat or American Pharoah. Stay tuned for layer 2 of the Kentucky Derby winner's iceberg.